So I would like to talk in this presentation about Maimonides and his view or views on the possibility of moral improvement. This is part of a larger project which I hope to take into account as the full picture, as full a picture as I can present. In this presentation, I'll be paying particular attention to the role of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, because this will be a lecture that I will give at a conference in Madrid. So what I'm asking here are two questions. The broader question is, can we improve our moral character at all? Is it something that we're born with and we can't change? And given the possibility, which one would expect, certainly on the part of Maimonides, that the answer is that we can improve our moral characters, the question is how much? Are there any innate constraints on the capacity of a given individual to achieve moral perfection? As I said, I'll be concentrating in this talk mostly about the relationship between how Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics fits into this question, but just to give a sort of quick general answer, the answer is of course complex. It's not simple. I think that Maimonides, in theory and to a great degree in practice, certainly in his preaching, accepts the view of the Nicomachean ethics as interpreted by al-Farabi, that there are no innate constraints, but in line with medical theory, with which he was very familiar, and the close connection between body and soul, which the medical theory urged, and of course there's a sort of overlap between medicine and philosophy. Maimonides, I think, recognized the power, in many cases the great power, of innate or ingrained constraints. Once again, in keeping with the theme of the conference, I'll be focusing in this presentation mostly on Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. Now, the question that I've posed as the theme of this talk was considered at the time to be a great debate between the two towering figures of philosophy, Aristotle and Plato, taking opposing sides on the question. One of a number of issues in which there's sort of like two basic approaches, and one was associated with Aristotle and one with Plato. And then, of course, there was the tradition or the attempt to harmonize the views, and some will show that they agreed, which is what al-Farabi did in his book on the harmonization of the two sages. And we'll start by presenting the debate as it was presented in that book by al-Farabi, or attributed to al-Farabi. Here on the screen, shots of one of the Arabic printings of the book in the original Arabic, and the collection of political writings by Charles Butterworth, in which this treatise is also presented in modern English, and I'll be citing from Butterworth's translation. We'll also be explaining briefly why it's considered a political writing. I should add that the authenticity of the attribution to al-Farabi has been challenged, most recently in a long article by Marwan Rashid, and it doesn't really matter for the point of view of this paper whether al-Farabi is the author or not, particularly since Rashid, as an alternative, suggests that the book came out of the circle of Yahya ben Adi. Either way, it represents sort of the state of the art. I mean, the sort of issues as they were considered and debated by philosophers in the earlier phases of Islamic philosophy, and when they were dealing with the Hellenistic tradition, the tradition of views and texts ascribed to Aristotle and Plato, and the attempt of later philosophers who are mentioned by Farabi, such as Porphyry, to resolve these disputes or harmonize them. And so that's really what's important here. It presents here in a clear and stark fashion the two alternatives, which I have phrased in my opening questions, and towards the end of the talk, I will share with you some of my ideas how this debate had morphed into something somewhat different by the time of Maimonides. So let me begin by just reading to you the presentation of the debate as it appears in the book of al-Farabi. It's the only disagreement between Aristotle and Plato that concerns the field of ethics. And here I would simply read the passage. Another instance is the moral habits of the soul. I'm not dwelling here on Butterworth's translation. I have perhaps some alternative suggestions, which I think may be better, which I'll present in a paper to be published later. I'll just read his translation. Another instance is the moral habits of the soul, and they're presuming that Aristotle's opinion about them differs from Plato's opinion. That is because Aristotle explicitly declares in his Nicomachean ethics that all moral habits are habits, and that they undergo change, and that none of them is by nature, and that a human being is capable of moving from one to another by habituation. In other words, habits can be overcome by habituating a different or an opposing tendency, whereas nature cannot be undone. Plato explicitly declares in the Republic, and especially in the Statesman, that nature prevails over habit, that whenever the mature become naturally inclined to a certain moral habit, it is difficult for them to break it, and that when they do intend to break that moral habit, they become more embedded in it. To illustrate this, they're sort of spinning their wheels and sinking deeper into a rut. To illustrate this, he cites the example of a tree that is intruded upon a road by its inclination and crookedness. If one intends to clear the road, it must be pulled in the other direction. Otherwise, if we leave it to its course, it will take more from the road than it already has. No one who hears these two discourses will doubt that there is a difference between Aristotle and Plato on the issue of moral habits. As I said, I'm interested in Maimonides and his understanding of the debate, which, by the way, he may not have known by way of this treatise of al-Farabi, though Maimonides was a very great admirer of al-Farabi and relied heavily on some of his commentaries to Aristotle and praised al-Farabi in a way that he hardly praised anyone else except maybe for Aristotle. But there's no evidence that he read this book of al-Farabi. But simply for the sake of completion, I will summarize here, or I will cite the summation of Fawzi Najjar as to how Farabi harmonizes these views. If you remember, the title of his book is The Harmonization. He's trying to show how this debate, which seems to be a chasm between Aristotle and Plato, is really not a debate at all. They have a fundamental agreement with certain, nuances that make it look like they're disagreeing. So Najjar writes as follows: according to Farabi, this controversy arises from the fact that in his Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle discusses moral habits in general terms, asserting that they are rooted in the natural potentialities of an infant and are dependent upon education and training. Plato, on the other hand, is concerned in the Republican statesmen with political regimes and their importance in shaping and inculcating the moral habits of the citizens. Farabi recognizes that a person reared in certain moral habits may find it difficult to abandon them, but what is difficult is not impossible. He seems to skirt rather than confront the issue. In the final analysis, he seems to accept the Aristotelian position that moral habits are conventional features subject to changes in conditions and circumstances. So Maimonides may or may not have known of the debate as it's presented in the harmonization. I'll suggest towards the end of this talk that I think he knew of that debate, even if it was by way of a different text. But he certainly knew that the debate had continued, except that the protagonists were different. He presents this as a debate between all of the sages, including the opinion of the Jewish sages and the opinion of the Torah, who agree with Aristotle, and the astrologers, who are now maintaining what Plato was said to have maintained as presented in Farabi's harmonization. And I have here a citation from one of his early works, his sort of 8 chapters, which present is ethics. I have explained all of this to you only so that you do not hold to be true those fantasies, those ravings, those hallucinations that are invented by the astrologers. That is, that the nativities of people make them into those who possess virtues or vices. But you should know that our Torah and the philosophers of Greece both agree that all of a person's actions are within his own hands. There is no compulsion or external agent that pulls him in the direction of a virtue or a vice. There may be a temperamental readiness which, as we have explained, may make things more difficult or more easy. However, in no way at all is anything compelled or denied. Now, I think here Maimonides is perhaps mixing two questions, which in the course of this presentation and my work on this topic, I'm trying to keep separate. One is the question of freedom of the will, that there's no external compulsion to do anything, that the people can do as they wish and as they choose. But the other is the capacity to carry out this decision. I can choose freely to move the Eiffel Tower with my little finger, but I can't do it. It's simply physically impossible. And I think that some people would have said that this is very much the debate concerning the moral character of a person and the virtues and vices. The question is, if I choose freely to improve my moral character, and I choose freely to, say, suppress or get rid of my tendency to be angry or cheap or something, or intolerant or something like that, and things that one should be intolerant of, that one should not be intolerant of, then do I have the capacity to actually do this? Is there some innate characteristic of my physical makeup, of my body, my temperament, the heat that my body produces, let us say, in the medieval sense, which will prevent me from carrying out the decision that I arrived at freely? Now, moreover, we have to bear in mind that Maimonides, in speaking of the sort of unlimited capacity to change our moral character, is speaking in a sort of a political mode. That is to say, he may have accepted al-Farabi's resolution of the supposed disagreement between Aristotle and Plato with regard to political codes, as Farabi says that it is to be resolved. That is to say, that people can change their behavior to the extent that is needed to fit social norms. The political regimes, and these are the regimes, the law codes, which in the medieval conception are brought by prophets and by civil legislators as well. There's a difference between, of course, a prophetic code and something that a human king can come up with, but it doesn't concern what we're talking about here. These codes set limits on the type of excessive behavior that can be tolerated. They set social norms so that people can work with each other and live together. And this is something that we can expect that everyone can accept and adapt to. But speaking as a religious philosopher and having in mind those individuals who are seeking the ideal, the perfection, as Maimonides would call it, the perfection of philosophical, religious, or ethical ideals, which all really merge into one, then can these people achieve what they're after? To do much more than it's needed to be a law-abiding citizen and someone who contributes to society and doesn't have any conflicts. We're talking about people who want to press or shooting for the highest goals. And here the question comes up again. It could be that it's possible for all individuals, or except for those people who are so violent that they have to simply be incarcerated, but for almost all individuals to adapt their personal temperament, their personal characteristic to the limits that society imposes on the behavior of individuals. But it may not be possible for all individuals to refine their character even further and achieve, or at least come very close to the ideals that we find in the philosophical and religious literature. Now, I would like to look at a few passages from Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, where it seems to me that he recognizes innate limits on the possibility of people to improve their character, certainly to move well beyond the social norms towards perfection, and that these limits are not trivial at all. So, for example, in part 1 of the guide, chapter 34, Maimonides gives a list of 5 minimal requirements for initiation into divine science. Let's say theology, or the higher levels of theology. We don't teach everyone. We have to test candidates who want to be initiated into this science. Maimonides says there are 5 minimal requirements, and of these he gives the greatest attention to the 4th requirement, which he calls in Arabic istiadad, literally readiness, the being ready to accept some form. Penis in his translates it as natural aptitudes. But whatever the translation may be, we're speaking here of innate abilities, and Maimonides places a lower bound on these natural aptitudes, which are biological and innate. I quote, "There are moreover many people who have received from their first natural disposition." These 3 words in English, first, natural disposition, are all needed to capture the meaning of the Arabic word fitra. They receive from their first natural disposition a complexion of temperament, hayya mijaziyya. Again, in my paper, which will be in a printed presentation and not a slide presentation with lecture, I will go into a lot about these terms, but for here, let's leave it at that. Many people have received from the first natural disposition a complexion of temperament with which perfection is in no way compatible. Such is the case of the one whose heart is naturally exceedingly hot, for he cannot refrain from anger, even if he subject his soul to a very stringent training. So here we have a definite, innate, biological limit. Someone who has been born with a heart, which in the medieval biology is supposed to be a hot organ, but within certain bounds. But if they're always, each individual is different, and those whose heart is much hotter than the norm will not be able to refrain from anger, no matter how hard he or she tries, no matter what stringent ethical and moral training they take upon themselves. This sets a bound on their ability to achieve perfection, because without being able to refrain from anger, one cannot achieve the highest ideals. And we can also learn a lot about for the purposes of our question, from Maimonides' theory of prophecy, because among other things, a prophet is of course someone who brings a divine law code, some of them who brings warnings from God when the society or certain individuals have gotten out of line. But the prophet represents, for Maimonides, a human ideal. Only the best humans are worthy and capable of prophecy. And so by describing the prophet and the minimum requirements for prophecy, the minimum requirements are not there, they are necessary, though not sufficient to achieve prophecy. Is essentially describing the human ideal, and this is why it's so important for our questions. And so Maimonides again says that though prophecy is a certain perfection in the nature of man, there are necessary initial conditions that are due to nature. I quote, "Now you know that the perfection of the bodily faculties to which the imaginative faculty belongs, the prophet must have imagination, because prophetic visions are basically produced by the imagination, is consequent upon the best possible temperament, the best possible size, talking of the size of the brain, the best possible matter, the matter, the cells that make up the brain, the part of the body that is a substratum for the faculty in question. It is not a thing whose lack could be made good or whose deficiency could be remedied in any way by a regimen. To achieve perfection, if you're not born with it, there's no diet or exercise or training that can get you to that level of perfection. But with regard to a part of the body whose temperament was bad in the original natural disposition, the utmost that the corrective regimen can achieve is to keep it in some sort of health. It cannot restore it to its best possible condition. 2 chapters later in the guide, Maimonides is still talking about prophecy. He draws a clear analogy between psychic faculties, which is bravery or courage, which, by the way, are also required of the prophet. These are virtues that the prophet must have, because the prophet sometimes will have to, speak very sternly to a powerful and violent king. And Maimonides draws a clear analogy between these psychic faculties and corporeal faculties, such as repulsion of expulsion, the way the body gets rid of superfluities. Every person has this faculty. Every person is born with this biological faculty to get rid of superfluities or waste products, but its strength varies greatly from one individual to another. Another factor is temperamental preparation in the original natural disposition. And this is the Arabic words are all loaded, tahayu, mizaji, fiasal jibla. Though these capacities can strengthen or weaken in a given individual, their abundance or weakness manifests from infancy. In other words, we can see from infancy that people are born with greater or lesser amounts or strengths of these capacities, and they can be tweaked to some degree, but not beyond certain limits. The argument from infants and small children is important. Galen, in his Ethics, finds strong evidence for the innate character of ethical traits from the very different behaviors of small children. He goes so far as to compare their ethical traits with those of irrational animals. So Galen, he presents this as sort of a consensus among philosophers that these character traits are definitely innate. It's not to say that nurture plays no role, but there are certain things that we are born with. Galen says you see a group of children playing and one of them falls down. Some will go over right away and help him and cheer him up, and others will laugh or even hit him while he's down. And there's no way to explain this, he says, other than saying that these character traits are innate. So I began by showing how Maimonides, in line with the position that's identified with the Nicomachean ethics, argues that the people have the possibility for moral improvement. And this is something that is agreed upon by the philosophers of Greece and the Torah, the Jewish revelation. Then I've shown passages that show that, particularly when speaking of the person who's aiming for the ideal, Maimonides recognizes certain innate and insurpassable limits that are placed by biology and the whatever initial conditions that have been bestowed upon us. Did he know of the position of Plato as Farabi presents it in his harmonization? I mean, was he aware of this? And though, as I said, he there's no evidence that actually read the Plato's harmonization, he does present us with a very precious fragment from Farabi's commentary, his lost commentary, the Nicomachean Ethics. Farabi was the great mediator of Aristotelian philosophy to the Islamic world. And as I said earlier, Maimonides had a very high opinion of Farabi's commentaries on Aristotle's works. Not all of Farabi's works have reached us. And one of the works that has not reached us and which we sorely miss is his commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. But Maimonides presents us with one of the few citations that we have. And here, we see the position that was ascribed to Plato in the harmonization, again being ascribed to Plato, as I understand the passage. It comes at the end of the guide. Maimonides is not talking here anymore about prophecy, but he's talking about divine providence, the way God watches over the world and the people who inhabit it, Maimonides is arguing that he agrees with Aristotle, according to Maimonides' understanding, felt that divine providence in our world extends only to species. The deity will take care of that the human species will not disappear, but it doesn't extend to individuals, which is of course something that's extremely distasteful and unacceptable to religious thought. Maimonides claims that actually the philosophers agree that there is divine providence for individuals, but it's a function of those individuals' intellectual perfection, so that those who have achieved perfection, moral perfection, but mainly intellectual perfection, the more perfection or the greater amount of perfection, the closer they are to the ideal, the greater the divine providence that reaches them. And after making this point, which of course he considers to be important for Jewish belief, he, as is his wont in the guide, tries to show that it's not simply a matter of religious belief, but it's something that the philosophers have also accepted. And in that context, he says, I quote here at the bottom of this slide, the texts that occur with regard to this notion are so numerous that they cannot be counted. I refer to the notion of providence watching over human individuals according to the measure of their perfection and excellence. The philosophers too mention this notion. al-Farabi says in the introduction to his commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, those who have the capacity for making their souls pass from one moral quality to another are those of whom Plato has said that God's providence watches over them to a higher degree. Now, Maimonides has clearly pulled this quotation out of context. I'm brazen enough to say this, even though, of course, we don't have the full commentary. But it seems to me most likely that al-Farabi makes this point in the introduction to his commentary in the context of a discussion on the possibility of ethical improvement, which should be the central question of a book on ethics. I mean, a book of ethics is not simply to teach you what are good behavior and what are the bad behavior, what are the virtues and what are the vices, but how we get rid of vices and attain virtues. And in dealing with this, we have to talk about the question of how much of this improvement to perfection is possible. Maimonides, however, seizes upon the end of the sentence for evidence that the philosophers agree with him that divine providence over individuals is a function of the perfection of those individuals. Why then did Plato mention divine providence when he's talking here about the possibility for perfection? It seems to me that Plato intended the following. Radical change in character is so difficult and so rare that when achieved, it is assigned post facto divine providence. It's almost a miracle in the person who achieves it. So Plato is interpreted, as cited by al-Farabi, preserved by Maimonides, interpreted by me, holds that such radical improvement is nearly impossible, as he is said to have held in the harmonization, as we saw at the beginning of this talk. Therefore, when someone does manage to achieve such radical change from one character to another, from a vice to a virtue, it's certainly a sign that that person has been blessed with divine guidance. Now, since this presentation and the conference for which I've prepared it is focused on the Nicomachean ethics, I should say something more here about this citation. As far as I know, this citation that Farabi brings in the name of Plato has not been identified. The people it's known only from Maimonides' guide, and the people who have studied Maimonides' guide and translated it, great scholars such as Shlomo Munk and Shlomo Pinas and others, have not found the source for it. But more than that, the medieval commentators, Shem Tov ben Shem Tov and his father, Yosef ben Shem Tov, have both been astounded by the fact that this very idea that Maimonides finds in Plato by way of al-Farabi is found directly in the ethics, and Maimonides could have cited Aristotle himself. So here's what Shem Tov says in his gloss to the guide. I've put a picture from the printed version at the top of the slide. It's utterly stupefying that our teacher Maimonides should cite Abu Nasr from the beginning of the commentary of the Ethics, and not instead the due support from Aristotle, quote, the first of the sciences, who stated in the Ethics that a person who behaves according to reason should be loved by God. It may be the case that Maimonides did not see this treatise. That is, that Maimonides, maybe the reason he had to take this quotation from al-Farabi's introduction rather than directly from Aristotle's Ethics is that he never saw the Ethics, and that the citations that Maimonides brings from Aristotle are passages that the commentators have quoted. So he's making an interesting point, which should not be lost, I think, on modern scholars. He's already noticing that maybe Maimonides didn't read Aristotle. He read commentators on Aristotle and sort of pulled from them the things that they cite in the name of Aristotle. And here, whatever reason, he didn't have this passage from the Ethics, and therefore he had to rely on or cite this passage that from Plato that Farabi brings. And in fact, we have not really received the Nicomachean Ethics in Arabic in a very good form. As far as I understand, there's only one manuscript, which at the time that it was studied by Dunlop, a great scholar of the mid-20th century, was already in a degenerate state, and apparently it's gotten worse. I don't know exactly the situation today. It's the original was in Morocco. It was Dunlop worked on it. He didn't live to publish it, but recently Anne Akasoy and Alexander Fyodora have gone through Dunlop's notes and edited them, worked on them, added a lot of modern scholarship in their own, and presented it. It's still not in the greatest shape, but so we do rely on this one manuscript and citations here and there, and again just a few citations that we have from Farabi's commentary. Okay, so now it's time to sort of sum up and present here in a concise form the conclusions of this particular piece of research of mine. The Arabic tradition inherited from the Hellenistic one the idea that one of the major differences of opinion between Plato and Aristotle concerned the possibility of moral improvement. Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics, held that a person could change character freely, that is, could change freely from one extreme to another, whereas Plato maintained that there were inborn traits that could not be overcome. Maimonides presents essentially the same disagreement as one between the Greek philosophers who held like Aristotle and the astrologers who held like Plato. Even if Maimonides accepted al-Farabi's resolution, that is to say, harmonization of the two sages, so that they both agreed that people can improve their moral character enough to comply with the norms and laws of society, nonetheless, this solution need not apply when speaking of the individual in search of perfection. So, regarding the individual, especially the one seeking perfection, Maimonides acknowledges an important role for biology. The temperament and other biological features of the body have a significant effect on the soul and the dispositions that the soul must acquire for moral perfection. In some way, the classical disagreement between Aristotle and Plato is now morphed into a medieval split between Aristotle and Galen. This is not quite accurate, as Galen has strong evidence that both Aristotle and Plato maintained that the body has a strong influence over the soul. I'm here compressing two ideas. First of all, that just as the classical world knew of these great disagreements between Aristotle and Plato and tried to either take sides or resolve them, the medieval world knew of a great split between Aristotle and Galen, or philosophy of medicine. For example, whether the chief organ of the body is the heart or the brain, whether the woman contributes to the embryo form as well as matter. But this is not quite true for a number of reasons, particularly because Galen, in his book on that the soul follows the temperament or the makeup of the soul follows upon the temperament of the body, argues strongly that this is the position of all the philosophers he knows, including Plato, and he argues, he has some strong remarks against the people who think that because Plato was such a strict dualist between, there's this sharp distinction between spirit and matter, that Plato would not have thought so. He says this is not true, and that Plato, too, argues that the body is a strong influence over the soul. And finally, the Nicomachean ethics play a role in Maimonides' thought, mainly through the mediation of al-Farabi, and in his both in his commentary to the ethics and his aphorisms of the statesman, al-Fasul al-Madani, which I have not talked about here. It's not certain at all that Maimonides had direct access to Nicomachean ethics. Thank you very much, and of course you're welcome to leave comments if you so feel moved to do. Thank you very much.